All right. Okay, everybody be quiet while I do the opening introduction. Here we go, everybody. It's Saturday.
They can't see you.
Good morning, everybody. This is Kathy L. Murphy, the Pulpwood Queen. And I have a brand new tiara this year that I think is just fantabulous. And I'm so excited to be here this morning. Saturday is always a real treat. And we are headed off this morning with our opening program with Jonathan Haupt, of the executive director of the Pat Conroy Literary Center. And he has a special guest he's going to be introducing in just a minute. Before we begin, I just have to tell you, if you read my book, which is the Pulpwood Queen's Tiara Wearing Book Sharing Guide to Life, you will see that I do give homage to Pat Conroy, who is my favorite author's body of work. His books made me realize that for the first time in my life, there was somebody else that went through similar experiences. I had a military father, a two-time Korean War veteran, and he ran all of us girls like he was in the Army. And I appreciate all those things now, but it was pretty rough when we were little girls. But I love his books, and I have to tell you that, you know, I grabbed a few of them, but if you have not read them, I have all of them, and I have most of them autographed. But here's one of his newer ones, The Death of Santini. The Great Santini, Lords of Discipline, were probably the first two books. I don't know which one I read first, but they are absolutely as relevant today as they were when they were published. And when I had Pat Conroy come to the Girlfriend Weekend, the first time, he called me a month after the event and said, never had this happen before, but he said, Kathy, can I come back? I said, oh my gosh, yes, you can come back to Girlfriend Weekend, because he helped us start our author dinner where the authors waited the tables. And the look on my Pulpwood Queens from New Boston Hooks and Texarkana, it was the first table he went to. And he had on these aprons that all the authors autographed. And he said, would you like sweet tea or unsweet tea? And the girls just looked up, and I'll never forget the look on their faces. They have never been so. Pat Conroy was waiting on them. The generosity of this man and what he did to promote authors and reading and literacy is legend. The Pat Conroy Center is my heart. Till my dying day, I'll be promoting this center and having the fundraiser go to all the literacy and literary events they're doing to help young people and authors and readers and promote writing. And he called me and he said he wanted to come back. And I said, Pat, will you have a new book? And he said, I will. And I said, no, wait, I know how long it takes for you to write a book. He goes, I promise you, I will have a book. And that book was My Reading Life. And that is in the Pat Conroy package for the auction. I bought so many signed copies, and I have been giving them out for years to all my Pulpwood Queens. But from the Boo to The Water is Wide, The Great Santini, Lords of Discipline, Prince of Tides, Beach Music, My Losing Season, the Pat Conroy, South Abroad, I can't say enough about it. And the last thing I want to say, the biggest accomplishment in my life, besides having my children, was not getting my own book published. It was not any of the awards that I've been given. It was the fact that I was invited to write a chapter in our Prince of Scribes. It's won 20 awards, I believe 20 awards, and to have my sticker included as an official Pulpwood Queen Book Club selection with my story. And we all thought our stories were so unique, but there's a common thread. If you have not read these books, you have to read them and support the center. So I'm not going to talk anymore because this is a wonderful morning. I want to introduce Jonathan Haupt, and I'm turning the program now all over to you. Thank you. Here we go.
Pulpwood Queens meant so much to Pat Conroy. As I got to write about in the afterword to the 20-year anniversary collection the Pulpwood Queens put out, Pulpwood Queens really restored Pat's faith in readers and the literary community at a time when he absolutely needed that. It was a transformative experience for him to get to go to Jefferson and to meet y'all. And I'm so glad that we get to do this virtually this morning. I'm actually in the Pat Conroy Literary Center. It's not a virtual background behind me. This is a full wall mural that was donated to the center, very much the kind of landscape that Pat would look out at and describe. And I'm not just anywhere in the Conroy Center, I'm at Pat Conroy's desk in the very chair that he sat in when he wrote Beach Music and some part of every book that followed that. Holland Perryman, the one and only legendary intern from the Pat Conroy Literary Center, is coming to us live from the private island where she lives, Themyscira, I believe it's called. So we're gonna co-present this morning a really wonderful talk about how Pat Conroy became that wonderful human being that so many of you got to meet and we all came to love. And we're gonna do that with some visual storytelling. So I'm about to share my screen here. And give me 1 second to do that. There we are, and fire this thing up. Now, this is a presentation called Pat Conroy's Reverence for Teaching, which is really about a central theme in Pat's life. And it's a presentation that Holland and I have gotten to give together dozens, maybe even hundreds of times. How many times have we done this together, Holland?
Once.
Once, yes. So this is the second time. But tell you very quickly a little bit more about us before we turn it over to Pat Conroy. We are incredibly famous. I am, as you can see, the world's okayest mentor. Holland is the world's most awesome intern this morning. Yes, thank you. Nice job. Just to give you some sense of our relative fame, Holland is on the cover of this month's issue of Beaufort Lifestyle magazine, our local glossy magazine. I was once on the cover of the inmate newsletter of the Allendale Correctional Institute prison. So Holland may be just a little bit more famous than I am, but we're here to talk about a guy who's more famous than both of us, and indeed all of us, and that's this guy, Pat Conroy. New York Times best-selling author of 12 books. And if you're not familiar with all 12, I bet at the very least, you are familiar with the 4 that were made into major motion pictures, which are these 4. There we are. And that's Conrack, released in 1974, based on Pat's book, The Water's Wide, about his year teaching on Defusky Island. And The Great Santini, made it into a film in 79, The Lords of Discipline in 83. And of course, Pat's great big hit, Prince of Tides, released as a film in 1991. Great Santini and Prince of Tides were both filmed primarily right here in Beaufort. What all 4 of these films, their corresponding books, and indeed all 12 of Pat's books have in common is they always relate back to relationships between teachers and students, to the idea of being an educator, being a lifelong learner, and a lifelong student. And that's the Pat Conroy that we want to tell you about this morning, because that's the Pat that we honor here at the Conroy Center. And that's what you all are supporting by virtue of the auction through Pulpwood Queens. So let's go to this Pat Conroy. This is a photo from 1968. This is Pat when he's about 23 years old, after his first year as a teacher, which I'll get to tell you about in a little bit further down the path here. What I want to show you is the rest of the family, because of course, Pat spent a great deal of time talking about all of these folks and writing about them as well. He's the oldest of 7, surrounded by his siblings there, but of these 7 kids, 3 out of 7 of them go on to become published writers. Next to Pat in the back row in the red orange coat, that is his sister Carol Ann, who goes on to become a published poet. And up front in the glasses is a guy that many of you have met because he came to Pulpwood Queens Girlfriend Weekend 2 years ago. That's Tim Conroy, now a published author as well, and a big part of what we do here at the Conroy Center. Up in the very front there, of course, are Pat's parents, Colonel Don Conroy, the real Great Santini in his dress uniform. Colonel was one of the most highly decorated fighter pilots of his generation. He served with distinction in World War II, in Korea as a member of the Black Sheep Squadron, and then 2 tours of duty in Vietnam. Don had clearance to deliver atomic weapons. That's how good of a fighter pilot he was. But he was a guy, like many men of his generation, who could not leave the battle on the battlefield. And he was physically and verbally abusive to this whole family. And Pat, as the oldest, as the firstborn, got the brunt of that, along with Pat's mother, who is the counterbalance to the physicality of the colonel. That's her on the other side there. Let's have another look at Peg. And yes, that is adorable baby Pat Conroy that she's holding in her arms there with the same smile he had throughout his whole life. Peg grew up in the backwoods beyond the backwoods without much access to education. It's entirely possible she never graduated from high school, but she found her way to books and libraries and librarians at a very young age, and that became transformative for her. She fell in love with the power of words and story, and she educated herself. And that is a lesson she started instilling to Pat at a very young age. Pat's mother was born with the name Frances Dorothy Peake, but she changed her middle name to Margaret and was known as Peg or Peggy her whole life because of this book, Gone with the Wind, and its author, Margaret Mitchell. She loved this story of empowerment, and she started reading this to Pat Conroy when he was 5 years old as a kind of bedtime story. Gone with the Wind is not age-appropriate reading for a 5-year-old. It was not in 1950, it's not now. But she read this to Pat in a way that she was able to equate every single character in Gone with the Wind with real people in Pat's life. So at a very young age, at the age of 5, he is learning that the world of literature and the world of our lived experiences are really one world, one story, interwoven. And that shapes his life as a writer, as a person, and as a student. Conroy's come here to Beaufort in 1961 when Pat Conroy is 16 years old. And at this point, I'm going to turn the story over to another 16-year-old, to Holland, to tell this part of our story. So take it away.
Hello. So, starting here in this story, he has lived in over 20 different places. He's gone to many, many different schools, all of them private until he got to Beaufort. And he was very shy as a kid when he was traveling all the time at different schools, different places. Just like a lot of military kids still today, did not have deep connections anywhere, did not get very involved because he knew he would be up and leaving soon. And when he was heading to Beaufort, they did know that he would be able to finish both years of high school at Beaufort High School. So we had a little bit of a sense that he would be there for a while. Maybe this could be a little different for him. So he was on the way to Beaufort with his mother when he started sort of expressing concerns about this lack of sense of place. He felt like he didn't have a home anywhere. Because they had always been moving, because he was a military brat, he felt sort of lost. And she told him, no, you have it all wrong. Just because we keep moving doesn't mean you can't have a hometown. It just means you get to pick it. So that sort of changed his perspective a little bit, but so did the town when he got there. And the winding rivers, the salt marshes, the culture, and Beaufort High School when he arrived. So for the first time, he actually became involved in the school and became the person that we knew him as an author. So we have him here as an outstanding athlete. He played basketball at Beaufort High, and then as many of us know, he played at the Citadel as well. And we have a nice long list of things that he did at Beaufort High School. We have best all around class vice president. He played football, basketball, baseball. He was in the National Honor Society. He was the class president. He was Mr. Congeniality. He was literally everything that you could be at the time at Beaufort High School. And he was MVP of his basketball team as well and team captain. So all of a sudden he was becoming this super popular, super well-liked guy that we know him as when he becomes an adult. And here we have the literary magazine that he was a part of. In his junior year, he published works in it, and he became sort of interested in letting other people read his work outside of his circle, outside of his family and his friends. And he was definitely, he was very interested in this. And in his senior year, he decided to join the staff. And that comes full circle the rest of his life, because even when he was a kid, even when he was 16, 17 years old and had a million other things to do, even then he wanted to help other writers. And the person in the middle we have there, I'll talk about just really briefly. That's Stephanie Austin Edwards, and she is one of the reasons that I have this internship. I absolutely love her. I first knew her from the church that we both go to. She's one of the coolest people you'll ever meet. She knew Pat in high school and then went to New York after high school, and she had a long career in Broadway and Hollywood, costuming and as a dancer, and worked with some of the most famous celebrities at the time. She's just amazing. I love her. And then she came back to Beaufort and reconnected with Pat Conroy, and she became a writer. And so she has a book called What We Set in Motion. and she got me connected to the center. So I'm a huge fan of hers. And yeah, so I think we do talk about her a little bit later, but yes. So he was meeting these students and connecting with students, becoming really involved. And he also formed connections with his teachers for the first time. He was on the lookout for a man that he could admire and look up to, because as we've established, he did not have a good relationship with his father. And he very desperately did not want to become his father. That was really, really important to him, to find someone else to look up to. So that's what he was on the lookout for when he walked into his junior year English class in 1961, and he found Jean Norris, who was his English teacher. And this is what he has to say about Mr. Norris. His eloquence was so understated that it was almost unnoticeable. He displayed a complete assurance in the composure and ease he brought to the art of teaching. At the end of the first day, I was impressed with the man. By the end of the first week, I was in love with him. He taught his students a language that was fragrant with beauty, treacherous with loss, comfortable with madness and despair, and a catchword for love itself. So the word that comes up again and again in there is the word love. And that's true throughout his life. He was not ever able to separate love and teaching, because love was teaching. And he connected love and stories. Love was listening and love was sharing for Pat Conroy. And he ended up using a lot of Mr. Norris's teaching lessons in his own teaching career. So Mr. Norris believed in an integrated classroom. He brought classical music into the classroom. And when we read The Water is Wide, we see Mr. Conroy do the same thing with these kids, bring in sensory learning and find any way to connect with these children. He also, both teachers were big believers in field trips, that there was a lot to learn out in the world, and that most of what we learn is really beyond the classroom. And one of the most formative experiences for Pat happened on one of these field trips. So Mr. Norris took him to Hampton Plantation, which is between Myrtle Beach and Charleston, and it's a state park now, I believe, that you can visit. Maybe not right now because of the current state of the world, but at some point you can visit. And he took him to meet Archibald Rutledge, who was South Carolina's first poet laureate. Now, for some context with this situation, Mr. Rutledge, he wrote poems and short stories, and a lot of these were published in boys' adventure magazines. So this means that this is not a writer that's far removed from Pat, but one that he admired, one that he read often, that he knew. This was a celebrity, an idol. And he was taken to meet him. And Mr. Rutledge could have easily had a short conversation with him and sent him on his way. And that would have been perfectly fine. That would have been all right. But instead, he decided to spend the entire afternoon with Pat, walking him around the grounds and teaching him the history of the land, and showing him the plants and the animals and giving him their names and all of these things. And as the afternoon was drawing to a close, he took Pat into his study, and he told him, he handed him one of his poems, and he asked him, "What do you think? Like, how could we improve this?" And Pat was absolutely baffled, confused, shocked, because his idol was asking him his opinion, this 16-year-old high school kid, his opinion on his writing. And Pat sort of mumbles something about maybe a stronger ending with a rhyme, and he's kind of terrified. And the afternoon comes to a close. And on their way back, Mr. Norris, he's talking with Pat, and he asks him, "What did you learn today?" So this is definitely a question that I get a lot from my parents pretty much every single day after school, and I do the same thing that Pat did. He started parroting back what he had learned. He was like, oh, "Okay, well, this is like the names of the plants and the animals, and here's some of the history." And Mr. Norris kind of cut him off, and he said, no, that is not what you learned today. Today, you learned how a writer treats another writer. You learned how a writer treats a no-account, snot-nosed high school kid from nowhere who has the same aspirations that he once had." And Pat responds with a nice line here. He says, "If I ever get to be a writer, I'll be nice to every kid I meet." Now, that is a bold and ambitious statement for a 16-year-old kid to make, who I'm sure had no actual imaginings of becoming a world famous author, but he does, and he did. And he held true to this promise, and was actually very, very well known for having a conversation with every single person in the lines to get their books signed, and asking them about their day, how they were doing, and helping writers and connecting them in the publishing world, and giving advice and asking about their work. So he was very, very well known for ending up holding true to this promise. So Mr. Norris and Pat get to be lifelong friends. And on the right, we have Mr. Norris. It's not an award ceremony for Pat, it's for Mr. Norris, actually. And he's receiving Lifetime Achievement Award, I believe, for education. And then on the right, we have Pat, and they are in Barbara Streisand's New York apartment, which, by the way, is like the coolest statement ever to make to even get to talk about. And that is after the premiere of The Prince of Tides, and he wanted his teachers there with him. And then on the right, we have the next character in our story, who is Bill Dufford. Bill Dufford was the principal of Beaufort High School, and most kids are not good friends with their principals. That is not normal, but Pat is, of course, the exception. And this is what he has to say about Mr. Dufford. I was in the middle of a childhood being raised by a father I didn't admire. In a desperate way, I needed the guidance of someone who could show me another way of becoming a man. It was sometime during that year when I decided that I would become the kind of man that Bill Dufford was born to be. I wanted to be the type of man that a whole town could respect and honor and fall in love with, the way Beaufort did when Bill Dufford came to town to teach and shape and turn their children into the best citizens they could be. So this is another figure that Pat gets to look up to in sort of replacement of his father. And the summer that we're talking about in this quote is the one after his junior year. So Pat's father wanted all of his kids to volunteer in some way in their community. That was sort of a requirement that they had to do. And so Pat decided to work at the school, doing manual labor, landscaping, painting, that kind of thing. And he couldn't get paid. That was the rule. So instead of a paycheck, Mr. Dufford came to the school every day and took him out to lunch, and he paid him in food and good conversation. So he would take him downtown. They would sit down at the table and they would talk about whatever was going on in the world at the time. And one of the big things going on in the world at the time was segregation and this possibility of integration. That was a very, very significant topic of conversation. And Mr. Dufford, he had been raised in the Jim Crow South, and he was opposed to integration. That's how he had lived his whole life. But in this way, Pat was actually much more worldly. He had lived all over the place, and he had already gone to school with an integrated system, and he was able to tell Mr. Dufford how it worked and how successful it was and how important it was that we move towards this step in our history, and that we be on the right side of history. And Bill Dufford, well, okay. So I would say that part of this is that it really did influence the way that Mr. Dufford ended up living the rest of his life, but it also showed Pat what a good leader was, that a leader listens, and a leader is always actively trying to learn, even if it is from a 16-year-old kid. So Mr. Dufford ends up returning to college. He gets a doctorate in education, I believe, from the University of Florida, and he ends up becoming a champion of integration in South Carolina. So on the left, we have him, this is in Sumter, South Carolina, where he worked on integrating the schools, and that ended up getting covered by the New York Times, and it became a model for how to integrate schools. That's how successful and important it was. And it's pretty amazing to think that a small part of that huge, huge movement was a conversation in a restaurant with 16-year-old Pat Conroy. And then on the right, we have an award ceremony, again, not for Pat, but for Mr. Dufford, and he is receiving the Governor's Award for Humanities for his 40-year career in education, which is pretty incredible. So our last character we are introducing is Anne Head, and that is the pen name of writer Anne Morris. She is the author of many books that have been on reading lists for schools for decades. She's an incredible writer. And Mr. Norris tracked her down, his English teacher that we mentioned before tracked her down and asked if she'd be willing to teach a creative writing class. And that's how she came to Beaufort High, because Mr. Norris wanted these kids to learn writing, and he knew that he wasn't necessarily equipped to do that. So he tracked her down, asked if she'd be willing to teach a select few students, one of which was Pat Conroy. So she was not a trained teacher in the sense that Bill Dufford and Mr. Norris she was, let's just say she was a little different. So this is what Pat had to say about her. On first sight, Mrs. Morris projected a steely withholding and icy reserve that would have been off-putting to me, except for the thrilling fact that she was the first novelist I'd ever met in the flesh. She looked like a woman who would not tolerate a preposition at the end of a sentence or the anarchy of a dangling participle. So she was definitely very, very different for Pat in the sense that she was not this trained teacher. And he was still absolutely thrilled to be taught by a real writer. But when his father found out, he was not happy at all. He wanted his son to be a fighter pilot. And he could not think of anything more useless than a creative writing class, which is very funny seeing how it turned out in the end. But at the time, he was not going to tolerate this. So instead of giving up, she kept Pat's name off the roster and continued to teach him sort of in secret and kept it from his dad. So they continued to have a relationship after Pat left high school. It was a pen pal relationship because she was most herself when she was writing. And that came through so well in the letters that they interchanged when he was in college. And he would send her his poems to critique, and she was incredibly supportive, which is saying a lot because he was not particularly good yet. And she was able to continue to encourage him. So we have a quick fun story here that he sent this poem in to be published in the Shako, which is the Citadel's literary magazine, in his knob year. So for context, I recently read Lords of Discipline, and my understanding is that when you're a freshman at the Citadel, your only job is to not die. That's all you're trying to do. You're trying to be quiet and invisible and not bother anyone because you're already going to get enough abuse. And can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. The dreams of youth are pleasant dreams of women, vintage, and the sea. Last night I dreamt I was a dog who found an upperclassman tree. So this, you can imagine, did not go over super smoothly with the upperclassmen of the Citadel. But we don't have to imagine because he actually wrote about it to Mrs. M, and this is what he says. The poems have been published, and one of them was nearly a preamble to my obituary. I was getting ready for noon formation when I looked toward my door. My roommate froze with fear. I was etched in doom. Milling out there were 1 million, yes, 100 million members of the upper classes. It was a lynch mob. Hatred shone round them, and I feared exceedingly. This is the upperclassman. Conroy, you not only found a tree, you found a forest. I was scared that day, Mrs. Morris, but the net result was they liked me a little better. So it did end up working out because he had the guts to do this. He sort of gained some respect and notoriety. Could have gone very, very badly. It sort of ended up being okay. So he did not get to have a lifelong friendship with Mrs. Morris, actually, because she passed away soon after he graduated. And this is what he had to say about that. At the time of her death, Mrs. M was the only writer I actually knew by sight, and it was her untimely and unforeseen death that robbed me of a mentor I thought would help me navigate the fearful world of American publishing. I was lucky that she found me as a boy, and whenever I publish a new book, I take a rose to her headstone and place it before her without a word, respecting her detachment as a part of the bond between us. So they did not get to have this lifelong friendship, but she was incredibly influential on who he became as a person and as a writer and as a teacher as well. So that's my little section, guys.
Thank you, Holland. Thank you. Well done, as always. Yes, appreciate that. Holland will come back and take another segment of our talk a little later, tell you a little bit more about our Conroy Center. But let me pick up our story right here. I'm absolutely amazed by the relationship that Pat had with Ann Head. The possibility that the best, most promising writer at Beaufort High School would get to work with an unorthodox, somewhat reluctant off-campus mentor seems pretty incredible. It's hard to imagine what such a pairing of mentor and student might look like if it happened today. We can only wonder what that might be. But I've gotten to know Anne's daughter, Nancy Thody, who's a pretty remarkable human being as well. And I asked her if she would show me where her mother's gravesite was, because I wanted to leave roses for the book of Pat's that came out after he passed away, Low Country Heart, and one for our Prince of Scribes as well, the book that Kathy mentioned in our introduction. And Nancy took me to that grave, which, as it turns out, is within walking distance of our Pat Conroy Literary Center and more or less across the street from Holland's Church. So it's right here in downtown Beaufort. And I got to leave the roses that we see there. Well, Pat was so inspired by this incredible pantheon of teachers that he had that he becomes a teacher himself after he graduates from the Citadel. He comes back here to Beaufort, South Carolina, and he becomes a teacher at Beaufort High. His mentor, Gene Norris, helped him get this job on a year-to-year contract. And he teaches at Beaufort High for 2 years, 1967 to 69. He is teaching government and psychology, and he's teaching psychology very much in the same way that his mother read Gone with the Wind to him. There seems to be no psychological condition that Pat has to teach that he cannot equate to one of his own family members. So he is teaching his high school psychology class by telling them stories about his family, which of course ultimately becomes his livelihood. In his second year of teaching at Beaufort High, he has an opportunity to do something that's pretty remarkable that I wish he would have had a chance to write more about. This is before the high school is integrated, but through a program called Freedom of Choice, there are about 100 African-American students on campus. And after the assassination of Dr. King, several of them come to Pat and ask him if he'll be faculty advisor for a student organization, the Afro-American Culture Club that they want to create. And Pat says he'll absolutely do that. He's the young liberal school teacher who's had the experience of integrated education. So he's very drawn to this idea, but he also wants to incorporate it into the curriculum. So Pat got to teach what may have been the first African-American studies class in any public school in the state of South Carolina in 1969. And I've gotten to talk to students, both Black and white, who were in that class. And they tell me how remarkable it was and how remarkable Pat was and how brave he was to teach this class at that time. He did not get to publish much about his years of teaching at Beaufort High, but every so often you find a little gem. And here's a good example. I consider the 2 years at Beaufort, give me 1 second to adjust my screen. There we are. I consider the 2 years in Beaufort when I taught high school as perhaps the happiest time of my life. My attraction to melodrama and suffering had not yet overwhelmed me, but signs were surfacing. No one had warned me that a teacher could fall so completely in love with his students that graduation seemed like the death of small civilization. If any of you are teachers in any sense of that word, you probably recognize this sentiment. It's really a lovely line. So I want to tell you about Pat as a teacher by sort of reversing our process. Holland got to tell you about Pat's teachers by virtue of Pat's memories. I'm going to tell you about Pat as a teacher by virtue of one of his students' memories. And it's this young woman here. This is Valerie Sayers. Her father was the civilian psychologist at Parris Island, our Marine Corps training depot here in Beaufort. So he did for a living the thing that Pat Conroy was stumbling around this high school classroom learning to teach. And Valerie should have been Pat's toughest critic, but here's how she described her teacher, Pat Conroy. This is from her essay in Our Prince of Scribes. We must have called him Mr. Conroy, but that's hard to imagine. Outside class, if we thought we were cool, we referred to him as Pat. When we gossiped, we called him Pat Conroy, one word on one breath, a movie star's name. When he paced our high school psychology classroom, he was all performer, good looking in a Paul Newman, Cool Hand Luke kind of way, only taller, younger, cooler. He was a master of the sudden pause, the beat, the punchline. He told us funny, self-deprecating stories, his fears, his gaffes, and we didn't believe a word. 2 years out of the Citadel, he was only 6 or 7 years older than we were, but he was Robert Kennedy, Wilt Chamberlain, and the Beatles rolled into one. Sounds like a remarkable teacher because he was a remarkable teacher. And in the same way that Pat became lifelong friends with so many of his teachers, he also became lifelong friends with many of his students, and Valerie is one of them. She's since gone on to be the author of 6 novels and more recently 1 short story collection, and she was inducted into our state's Literary Hall of Fame, the South Carolina Academy of Authors, 2018, and very much the same way her teacher, Pat Conroy, had been inducted in 1988. Pat was never Valerie's English teacher, but because he taught psychology as a series of stories, he did end up teaching storytelling to Valerie as a high school student, and that was very influential in shaping the arc of her life as writer, as teacher, as a wonderful human being. She also serves on our board of directors here at the Conroy Center, and she and Pat were lifelong friends. This is a photo of Valerie with Pat just before Pat's 70th birthday, and they're surrounded there by other members of that Beaufort High School psychology class that included Valerie. So after those 2 years of teaching at Beaufort High, things are changing here in Beaufort because integration is coming and private schools are popping up in response to that. And there's not a need for as many teachers at Beaufort High because there aren't as many students. And Pat's year-to-year contract was not going to be renewed for a third year. He very much wanted to stay in the classroom, and he thought about going into the Peace Corps. And then he realized he could have a Peace Corps-like experience without even leaving Beaufort County. And that's what took him out to Daufuskie Island, 1969, 1970, first year of teacher integration, meaning that schools in South Carolina are required to have teachers of multiple races. When Pat goes out to Daufuskie, he's not only the first white school teacher to ever teach on the island, he's also the first male school teacher. These kids didn't know that men taught. Pat gets out there very naive at this point and discovers that separate has not been equal at all. Through no fault of their own, these kids have been denied a level of education equivalent to their white counterparts. Many of them are illiterate. Some of them have no idea where they are in the world. They cannot point to Daufuskie Island on a map. They don't know the name of the Atlantic Ocean, even though that is the ocean that washes up on the shore of their island. And some of them thought Savannah was the largest city in the world because it was the only city they had ever heard of. That's what Pat encounters when he goes out to the island in 1969. And a lot of people would have simply given up at that point. But Pat Conroy is the son of a warrior. He does not give up, ever. He dedicates himself completely to educating these kids, not only what is required by the school district, but everything else he can do to prepare them for life off of their island, because he knows they're not going to have the same future that their parents had. He's got 18 students, grades 5 through 8, and no experience whatsoever teaching kids that young. And yet somehow he is remarkable at it because he is so dedicated to this experience. And here too, I want to share a memory of one student in particular, and it's a young woman who has her hand raised in the middle of that picture there. She is definitely a figure known very well to us here in Beaufort County. This is Sally Ann Robinson, and this is how she describes her teacher, Pat Conroy. That school year was unforgettable for me. Pat was patient and generous. He made every day an adventure while teaching us about history, math, spelling, reading, music, you name it, he taught it. And all the while, he was preparing us for the wide world we were going to face when we left our island. He could take the words in a book and bring them to life for us, and we were amazed. I got up every morning wanting to go to school because this wonderful teacher would be there who could make learning fun while opening our eyes to a future we didn't know was ours. Once again, he sounds like a remarkable teacher. And once again, this is an essay from our Prince of Scribes. Sally Ann goes on to have a remarkable life as well. She is now the author of 3 cookbooks. Pat wrote the foreword to her first one and toured nationally with her, and she and Pat became lifelong friends. She was featured in, the Oprah magazine just a couple of months ago, and in Garden and Gun before that, and she's been on the Food Network as a celebrity chef. She is an incredible human being. She also gives tours of Daufuskie Island. She's the only native islander to do that, and this summer, Holland and I got to go out to Daufuskie and spend the day with Sally Ann, having a pretty remarkable experience on one of those tours. Well, this was Pat as a teacher on Daufuskie, and in 1969, 1970 was apparently the wrong time to be quite so liberal and progressive in the eyes of the school board and school superintendent. And Pat's reward for being such a remarkable teacher was that he was fired. He decided to sue for wrongful termination. Again, he's the son of a warrior. This is how Pat has been raised. He's not going to simply accept defeat. And right up until the moment the judge delivered the verdict, Pat and his lawyer were absolutely convinced they were going to win that case, and Pat would go right back into the classroom. When he lost, he realized that his future was not going to be in the classroom, and it lit the spark in him to write his book, The Water is Wide, and every book that followed. The trial for wrongful termination became a national news story. Pat Conroy was famous nationally at 24 years old. as the fired white school teacher. So there was a ready-made audience for that book, The Water is Wide, when it came out, and the film Conroy as well. And that catapulted Pat into the life that he was going to have instead. Even though he never got to be a teacher in the classroom sense of that word, he continued to be a teacher in the big sense of that word his whole life. And this was a theme he continued to write about, as I mentioned in the introduction. Here's a quick example of that from Pat's best known book, The Prince of Tides, a short quote, but a powerful, meaningful one, I think. Pat is writing in the persona of the protagonist, Tom Wingo, but I think it's very much the writer, Pat Conroy, saying these words as well. There's no word in the language that I revere more than teacher. My heart sings when a kid refers to me as his teacher, and it always has. I've honored myself and the entire family of man by becoming a teacher. And indeed, that's what Pat Conroy did in the big sense of that word. He was always a teacher to many of us, including me, including Kathy, including several of us on this call this morning. And that's the spirit that we wanted to honor when we created our Pat Conroy Literary Center when Pat passed away March 4th of 2016. And the question became, how do you honor this larger than life figure? Well, it was with a living legacy and not a passive one. And that's what led to the creation of this center by Pat's family, by his agent, Marley Rusoff, by those of us to whom Pat was near and dear, who dedicate ourselves to what the center is so rapidly becoming here in Beaufort. We are a museum, and this is the desk I'm seated at this morning. This is Pat Conroy's writing desk from Fripp Island, the desk he used for beach music onward, and it's really the heart of our Conroy Center here. But most of what we do is bigger than just showing off exhibits. It has to do with education, and I want to tell you some quick stories about some of the kids we've gotten to work with, although obviously we work with adults as well. It's entirely free to visit our nonprofit, but we do happily accept donations, and thank you all once again who are participating in the Pulpwood Queens fundraiser auction for the center. This is our donation box here in the center, which was made by a group of high school students from May River and Bluffton, one town over from where we are. Coincidentally, when they dropped off the donation box that morning, they all came dressed as Pat Conroy. If you met him late in life, you'll recognize this is very much his uniform, khaki pants, a t-shirt. That's coincidental more than anything else. But they were a really wonderful group of students to get to know. Here's another very cool kid we've gotten to work with a couple of times. This is Anthony Johnson, and very much like Pat, he came here from elsewhere when he was 16, and he found his way to a good mentor. Her name is Mary Tebow. She owns Tebow Art Gallery about a block away from where I am, and she introduced Anthony to Pat Conroy's writing, to The Water is Wide in particular, when Anthony was learning a style of artwork called journal art. So this is his portrait of Pat Conroy done not just with drawing, but with words. Pat's portrait is created by Anthony writing out lines from The Water is Wide and then his own stream of consciousness to reading that book as a 16-year-old African-American student at the time he was working on this. Anthony graduated from high school last year. More recently, he's done a portrait of Cassandra King Conroy for us as well, which has now joined our visual arts collection here at the Conroy Center. So those are two examples of some great kids we've gotten to work with. I want to tell you about one more. And this is a figure we met earlier in our talk. This is Stephanie Austin Edwards, who was a classmate of Pat Conroy's, as Holland mentioned, and more recently, the author of this novel, What We Set in Motion, which is a Pulpwood Queen selection as well, I will happily point out. And Stephanie has become one of the great gems of my Beaufort experience, and I trust her completely. One day she came into my office and said, Jonathan, wouldn't it be great if we had a high school intern? And I said, no, Stephanie, that is a terrible idea. Let's make sure we never, ever do that, because the Conroy Center is very, very young. And I wasn't quite sure we knew what we were doing enough to bring a young student into this. But Stephanie proceeds to tell me about this precocious 14-year-old with a resume who's already proving herself to be a remarkable, multifaceted young woman. And she makes an incredible case for why I should meet and work with this student. And I keep wanting to say no. But then I hear a voice in my head, as I so often do, the annoying, self-righteous, and generally correct voice of Pat Conroy. And he said this: if I ever get to be a writer, I'll be nice to every kid I meet. Well, Pat is not around anymore to keep that promise, but I'm still here. We can do these things on his behalf. So I agreed to meet with a young student that Stephanie was championing. That was 2 years ago. And that is, of course, legendary Conroy Center student intern, Holland Perryman. And I am so grateful to Stephanie for introducing me to Holland, because this is a remarkable experience for me. And Holland gives me an endless catalog of reasons to be proud of her, which I could talk about at length, but instead I'm going to turn it back over to her to tell you a little bit about what she does, and by extension, what the Conroy Center does. So it's your turn again, Holland.
So this is not my favorite thing ever to do, is to talk about myself, but I do love talking about things that I love to do. So we're going to spin it that way and do it like that. So some of the things that I get to do for the center are stuff like this. I get to meet really, really amazing people through events and presentations like this. And I've done one workshop that I've taught, and I get to meet amazing people doing that. So that's something that I love to do. And I love to learn about stories and writing through that, whether from just sitting and listening in or getting to present and talk to people like you guys. So here's a picture. This is one of my favorite things I've gotten to do. So this summer we had a virtual Camp Conroy. So our Camp Conroy is where students come together and they create a book. And they do the writing and the illustrations and the cover and everything, and they publish an entire book. And we got to do that over Zoom this year, which was, I think, scary for all of us. But I had the most amazing time ever getting to meet these kids and laugh with them and try to teach them a little bit about storytelling and just having a good time. So it was amazing to meet these kids that are definitely smarter than me and cooler than I will ever be. And I just had a wonderful time doing that. And then we got to go to Defusky this summer as well. And that was when we got to meet Sally Ann Robinson, or I got to meet her officially. And I had an amazing time learning the history of a place that's so close and getting to see one of the most incredible books brought to life for me in the island, The Water is Wide. So that was amazing for me for sure. So we have the previously mentioned workshop that I got to do about dialogue. That was very, very cool, very scary to try to teach something that I'm still learning how to do. But that's sort of what this whole internship has been, is kind of along for the ride, learning as I'm growing and getting to do cool things. So that was amazing. And that's also a bear that we have. It's our mascot. I don't know how in length I have to talk about this. I call the bear Honey. Everyone else calls the bear Foggy. It is what it is. Yes, we have lots of fun at that center. The next thing that we're going to talk about, oh yes, interviews. So I have been interviewed a couple times, and that has been very scary and very terrifying. But the thing that I want to point out is that on the left, I think that was the first interview that I did. And I spent hours and hours memorizing my answers to the questions that I was going to say. And I was terrified and I was shaking, and it was super, super scary. And then on the right, that is a year later doing a similar interview. And it was still scary, but I realized how much I had grown from that time to the next time, and that I was learning to be a little more confident in what I was doing and getting to actually express how excited I was about all the opportunities that I've been given. So that's a very cool point of growth for me to look back at. I got to write a review for Spellbound Under the Spanish Moss. So that's an absolutely wonderful book, completely enchanting book that I think many of you guys know about. And it was an honor to get to review it. And then I got the really, really, really cool opportunity to actually talk to the authors. We did a Zoom interview Q&A type of talk, and I had the best time ever getting to meet the authors of this book and getting to talk to them and hear about everything that they had to say about their book and about their lives. They're some of the most interesting people that I've ever gotten to meet. So I had a wonderful time getting to do that. So that is a little bit about the things that I do. Yay.
And I will point out that Kevin Garrett and Echo are out there in Zoom land this morning. Hi guys, I can see you. I'm not sure Holland can at this point. So Holland is going to be co-host and presenter with me at our fifth annual and first virtual, March 4th, which is an event we put on commemorating the day that Pat Conroy passed away, not as a day of mourning, but as a day of education. And that is a virtual event, very much like the one we're in right now. So you all can sign up for that through our Eventbrite page or our Pat Conroy Literary Center page if you are interested. But I want to give the last word here to Mr. Conroy before I turn off our screen share and we wrap up our time with you all this morning. I want to share with you a letter that we received from Pat Conroy, effectively beyond the grave, in October of 2016. And it was a letter not from old man Pat Conroy, who was my friend and my mentor and my publishing partner, who we see in that photo. We actually got a letter from this guy from 1968, Pat Conroy, from first year teacher Pat Conroy. It's a letter that he had written after his first year of teaching at Beaufort High School, a letter written to his friend, his mentor, his own teacher, Bill Dufford, his high school principal. And because he wanted to thank Dr. Dufford for inspiring him, for setting him on the path to become the teacher and the man that he was at this point. So Pat wrote the letter, Bill received the letter, and nobody saw it again until October of 16, when Dufford found it in his archive. He's still alive, 93 years old this year, still actively involved in teaching. And he shared this letter with the rest of us. And even though it was very much about that moment in 1968, it also seemed to be about 2016, about the moment we were in when the letter was found. And that's why I say it really did feel like a letter from beyond the grave. Because October of 16 is when we were about to open our Conroy Center to the public for the first time, about to announce what began as our Pat Conroy 7th birthday party for Pat would continue as our annual Pat Conroy Literary Festival, as it does to this day, and about to announce that I would be leaving the University of South Carolina Press, where I was director, to become the first director of the Conroy Center instead, to go from working with a staff of 17 to working with a remarkable 16-year-old, which Holland refers to as a great upgrade for me, and she's not wrong. And that letter somehow seemed to be about all of those things as well. So let me share the closing paragraph of that letter, and that'll be our last thing before I switch off our screen share and get to see all of you again. This is Pat Conroy, 1968. I've never understood the dynamics of hero worship. Maybe it was the discovery of the father I never had as a youth and finally found in you. Father is not only stern, but tender, a father of both the storm and the sun. It is important for you to know this effect you have had, and I believe you know it, but in the shortness and horrible brevity of life, I want to get everything said, everything. Someday I'll exert the same influence over someone, and I want him or her to tell me. This is immortality. For what I have learned from you, I will pass on, and it will be passed on, and it will be passed on, and passed on. That's 23-year-old Pat Conroy writing to his friend and his mentor, Bill Dufford. And that last sentence is effectively the mission statement of our Pat Conroy Literary Center. That's what we do here, and that's what we've been doing through the magic of Zoom for this last hour. We have taken the lessons that Pat Conroy inherited from his teachers and shared with his students and his readers, and we've shared them with all of you, as I get to do with Holland so often, in the hopes that you will take charge of them and see that they continue to be passed on and passed on and passed on. And it's a great honor and privilege for us to get to do that. So I'm going to stop our screen share at this point and say thank you so much to all of you out there in Zoom land this morning, not only for joining us for this hour, but for everything you do in support of readers and writers and our wonderful literary community. This is a wonderful experience for all of us to get to share. And I'm so proud to know each and every one of you out there. So thank you all so much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Holland. I am absolutely thrilled that you could have present this at this time when we've had such a tough year of social distancing. I love the Pat Conroy Center. I love the family. I love all of you. We're a book family. And if anybody is listening to this, and when we post it in the future, if you can donate to the Pat Conroy Center, you are donating to a wonderful nonprofit who is promoting authors, books, literacy, and reading. This is important because, as I've said over and over, we want world peace. We've got to read, and we've got to thank all these mentors and teachers, and thank you, Holland, for leading the way for young people, because for any young person listening to this, I hope you'll join the Pulpwood Queens International Book Club, because we want the next generation to have this carry on too, because it's important that your life's work continues on. So support the Pat Conroy Center. Bid on that Pulpwood Queen fundraiser, everybody. Thank you so much. Big round of applause. You did awesome. And now let's continue. We're going to close this and we'll be going to our next panel, which is Annie McDonald of the Wright Review, and we're going to have a game show. So thank you, Jonathan, and we'll see you for the presentation later for the books of the year, because he'll be back. Thank you. Have a wonderful weekend. We love you.
Thank you all so much. See you later.
Bye-bye.